The village of Lockdub woke slowly, as it always did, with no sense of urgency and very little interest in the wider world. Dawn crept in over the hills like an apologetic guest, pale and hesitant, touching the frost-coated roofs one by one. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, polite columns, carrying the familiar scents of peat and tea leaves. Winter had settled in firmly now, not with drama, but with quiet persistence, and the villagers accepted it the way they accepted most things, with mild complaint and steady routine. Mrs. McLean was first to open her curtains, as she had been for the past 30 years. She stood with her mug of strong tea and surveyed the main street, noting with approval that nothing appeared to have changed overnight. The grocer's sign still leaned at its usual angle. The post office windows were dark. The road lay empty except for a single sheep that had wandered too far from the common grazing and now seemed faintly embarrassed about it. Satisfied, she closed the curtains again and made a mental note to mention the sheep to someone later. At the far end of the village, near the narrow track that led toward the hills, Hamish Macbeth was already awake. He sat at his small kitchen table, uniform trousers neatly folded on a chair, woolen jumper pulled on against the cold. Before him lay a plate of toast, untouched, and a mug of tea that had gone slightly lukewarm. Hamish stared out of the window at the gray sky, listening to the wind comb its fingers through the bare branches of the rowan tree in his yard. Winter always made Lockdeb feel smaller, more enclosed, as though the hills had leaned in overnight to listen more closely. Hamish did not mind that. He had grown up with the sense that the village watched itself, each croft and cottage forming part of a living organism that noticed every change, however small. In summer, secrets were harder to keep. In winter, they had a habit of settling into corners, growing heavy and cold. He took a sip of tea and made a face. It needed sugar. Everything, Hamish thought, needed a bit of sweetness to get through the colder months. By mid-morning, the village had found its rhythm. Doors opened and closed. Boots crunched on frozen gravel. The post van arrived with a cloud of exhaust and left just as quickly, its driver waving as though nothing in the world could be amiss. At the shop, Mrs. Wallace arranged loaves of bread with exaggerated care, pausing frequently to look out of the window in case someone passed by who might be in the mood for conversation. It was there, between the bread and the jars of sweets, that the first ripple passed through Lockdeb. "Have you seen Ain Fraser today?" Mrs. Wallace asked. No one in particular. Her voice casual, but her eyes alert. Mrs. McLean, who had come in for milk and gossip in equal measure, shook her head. "He's usually through early, isn't he, for his paper?" "Aye, even in weather like this," Mrs. Wallace said, lowering her voice a fraction. "Shepherds don't take days off, not if they've any sense." The words hung in the air a moment longer than necessary. Both women glanced toward the door, as though expecting it to open and prove them wrong. It did not. By lunchtime, the absence had been noted elsewhere. The sheep on the higher ground had not been moved. A gate along the hill track stood ajar, its hinge creaking softly in the wind. Angus McPhee, who considered himself something of an authority on such matters, mentioned it to Hamish when he stopped by the police station under the pretense of borrowing a newspaper. "Just seems odd, that's all," Angus said, shrugging into his coat. "My Ain's a careful man. Doesn't leave things half done." Hamish listened without interrupting, his expression mild. He had known Ain Fraser most of his life, a quiet, weathered man who spoke little and observed much, not unlike the sheep he tended. Reliable, certainly. Predictable. And in a village like Lockdub, predictability was its own kind of comfort. "I'll have a word with him later," Hamish said. "See? He's..." About? Angus nodded, apparently reassured, and left with the air of someone who had done his civic duty. The afternoon light faded early, drawing the village inward. Curtains were pulled, lamps flickered on. Somewhere, a radio played a familiar tune, slightly out of tune itself. Hamish pulled on his jacket and stepped outside, the cold sharp against his face. He walked without haste, boots finding their way along paths he knew without thinking. The track toward the hills was quieter than usual. The wind carried the sound of sheep bleating somewhere above, restless and unanswered. Hamish stopped at the open gate and rested his hand on the wood, feeling the grain rough beneath his glove. He noticed small things, as he always did. The way the latch had been left carefully balanced rather than dropped, the faint scuff marks in the frost that suggested someone had paused there, perhaps longer than intended. He did not feel alarmed. Not yet. But there was a faint tightening in his chest, the sense of a tune slipping just slightly out of key. As dusk settled fully over Lookdub, the village seemed to draw a collective breath. Windows glowed warmly against the dark. Supper was served. Conversation circled familiar ground, though more than one person glanced toward the hills, toward the empty track. Somewhere out there, a routine had been interrupted. And in a place like Lockdeb, that alone was enough to unsettle even the calmest of hearts. By the next morning, Lockdeb had acquired a new topic of conversation, and like all such topics, it moved through the village in a quiet, circuitous way. No one announced it outright. No one wished to be the first to say there was something wrong. Instead, people spoke around it as if approaching a skittish animal that might bolt if startled. The frost was thicker than the day before, whitening the low stone walls and turning every puddle into a dull mirror. Hamish Macbeth walked the length of the main street just after 8, nodding to those he passed. He was met with the same look more than once, a quick smile followed by a flicker of expectation, as though his presence might confirm or deny what everyone was thinking. At the shop, Mrs. Wallace was already busy, though there were fewer customers than usual. People lingered longer, bought less, and asked questions that had nothing to do with bread or milk. "Any word?" she asked Hamish, keeping her tone light. "Not yet," he said. "I'm heading up the track again later." She nodded, her mouth tightening briefly before she rearranged a stack of teens that did not need rearranging. Hamish stepped back into the cold, the bell above the door jangling more loudly than necessary. He paused outside, taking in the village as he had done countless times before, but with a slightly altered eye. Lookdub looked the same, neat, compact, and stubbornly ordinary. Yet there was a subtle tension to it now, like a held breath. At the edge of the village, the path toward the hills remained undisturbed, except for a single set of footprints, partly filled with frost. Hamish followed them slowly, his pace unhurried, though his attention sharpened with every step. He noticed how the sheep tracks veered away from the path sooner than usual, how the wind seemed to funnel itself down the glen in uneven bursts. He did not find Ian Fraser that morning. What he did find were small indications that something was amiss. A crook leaning against a dry stone wall where it would not normally be left, a thermos flask tucked neatly beneath a gorse bush, as if set aside with the intention of being retrieved shortly. Hamish crouched, examining the flask without touching it. He straightened again, exhaling slowly. Ian was not careless. If anything, he was meticulous to the point of stubbornness. Leaving personal things behind did not fit the man Hamish knew. By the time Hamish returned to the village, the news, such as it was, had already spread. "Ian's not answering his phone," someone said outside the post office. "He'd have been down by now," another replied. "Maybe he's gone to visit his sister at the Offord," though without conviction. Speculation in Logdub was a gentle thing. It did not rush. It did not shout. It moved like mist, seeping into corners and settling there. By midday, Hamish had made the decision he had hoped to avoid. He walked to the house at the edge of the village where Jane Fraser lived alone. The curtains were open. The door was locked. Everything appeared orderly, almost excessively so. Hamish stood on the step for a long moment before turning away. He did not force the door. There was no need. Whatever had happened had not begun there. The discovery came, as discoveries in Logdub often did, through a chain of small human decisions. Mrs. Kerr's niece had come to visit and wanted to see the sheep. Angus Macbeth, eager to be useful, offered to guide her partway up the hill. It was Angus who stopped short, his voice carrying faintly back down the track. Hamish arrived not long after, alerted by a breathless boy scent running ahead. Jane Fraser lay beneath a stand of birch trees, his form half sheltered from the wind. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no drama. He might have been resting, if not for the stillness that clung to him too tightly. Hamish removed his cap, standing quietly, while Angus spoke in a low, shaken voice. The cold had preserved the scene, rendering it strangely peaceful, almost kind. But peace, Hamish knew, could be misleading. He crouched near Jane, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. His eyes took in details without apparent effort: the shepherd's coat buttoned properly, his scarf arranged as though by habit rather than haste, his hands folded loosely. "It looks like he just sat down," Angus murmured. "Aye," Hamish said softly. "It does." The village gathered at a respectful distance, forming a loose, silent boundary. Faces were pale, expressions sober. No one cried out. No one asked questions. Grief in Logdub was private, shared through glances and silences rather than words. Hamish spoke gently, directing people back toward the village. There would be time later for explanations, for forms and phone calls. For now, there was only the task of bringing Jane home. As the light faded once more, Logdub changed. Doors closed earlier. Voices lowered. The hills, already close, seemed to press in a little tighter. Inside his small house, Hamish sat with a fresh cup of tea, staring into it as though answers might rise from the steam. Jane Fraser was dead. That much was certain. What was not certain was why. There was nothing violent here, nothing obvious, and yet Hamish felt the unmistakable tug of something unresolved, something rooted not in force but in feeling. In a village like Logdub, people did not simply disappear from their routines without a reason, and reasons, Hamish knew, were often far more complicated than they first appeared. The official words arrived from outside Logdub 2 days later, carried in on a gust of cold air and the presence of people who did not belong. A doctor from Inverness, brisk and efficient, confirmed what Hamish had already suspected. Exposure, the man said. The cold had been unforgiving. A heart weakened by age and long years on the hills might simply have given up. There were no signs of a struggle, no injuries that suggested foul play. It was, on paper, a simple matter. Simple matters, Hamish had learned, were rarely so simple in practice. The doctor left behind a formality that sat uneasily in the village. Exposure suggested accident. Accident implied carelessness, and carelessness did not sit well with anyone who had known Jane Fraser. The shepherd had survived harsher winters than this one. He had known those hills, like a second skin. At the shop, voices dropped whenever Hamish entered. People smiled at him, offered condolences, then hesitated, as though waiting for him to say something that would explain everything and restore the old balance. Aine wouldn't have stayed out so long, Mrs. McLean said one morning, folding her hands tightly in front of her, not without reason. Hamish nodded. No, he agreed, he wouldn't. He spent that day walking, revisiting places that had already become faintly altered by memory. The open gate had been closed now, the crook removed, the thermos flask returned to Yane's house by careful hands. The hills had resumed their usual indifference, sheep moving in slow, unbothered clusters. Yet the sense of interruption remained. Hamish stopped often, not to look for evidence in the usual sense, but to listen to the wind, to the rhythm of the land, to his own thoughts. He found himself thinking less about the place where Yane had been found and more about why he might have been there at all. The birch stand was not on Yane's usual route. It was a detour, a small one, but deliberate. Back in the village, routine struggled to reassert itself. The pub reopened, quieter than usual. The post arrived. The sheep were tended by a cousin from further north. On the surface, locked-up carried on. Beneath it, conversation shifted subtly. He'd seemed worried last week, Mrs. Wallace mentioned, passing Hamish his change. Didn't say why, just stood there longer than usual, staring at the shelves. Worried about what? Hamish asked. She shook her head. That's just it. He didn't say others offered similar huff memories. A moment of distraction, a sharp word where there had never been one before. A visit made later than usual, or not, actually, none of it amounted to much. But taken together, it suggested a disturbance that had begun well before the cold night in question. Hamish paid a visit to the kirk, where the minister sat in the small vestry, writing a sermon he would later discard. Aine came to see me, the minister said after a pause. About 3 days before he died. Hamish raised an eyebrow slightly. Did he? Aye. He didn't want anything. Exactly. Just wanted to talk. And what did he talk about? The minister hesitated, then sighed. The village. Change. How things don't stay as they were. He said something about promises, about people forgetting them. Hamish thanked him and left, the words echoing quietly in his mind. Promises, forgetting. These were not matters for the police ledger. They belonged to the untidy realm of human feeling. That evening, Hamish sat in the pub with a single pint, nursing it slowly. He did not ask questions outright. He listened. He let the room fill the silence for him. At a corner table, 2 men argued softly about grazing rights. Near the fire, Mrs. Kerr spoke in low tones to her niece, her hand resting possessively on the girl's sleeve. From time to time, someone mentioned Ayane's name, then glanced at Hamish, as though checking whether it was permitted. What struck Hamish most was not what was said, but what was not. No one spoke of enemies. No one suggested ill will. Instead, there was a shared unease, a sense that something deeply personal had been left unresolved. Later, walking home beneath a sky heavy with stars, Hamish thought again of the birch trees, of the way Aine had been seated, as though waiting, of the care with which his belongings had been set aside. Exposure might explain how Aine died. It did not explain why he had stayed. The answer, Hamish suspected, lay not in the hills, but in the village itself, in its quiet understandings, its unspoken rules, and the gentle pressures it exerted on those who lived within it. Locked Up was not a place of violence. It was a place of memory, and memory, when stirred, could be just as powerful. As Hamish reached his door, he paused, looking back toward the darkened street. Somewhere behind those walls, someone knew more than they were saying. And whoever that was, Hamish thought, might not even realize the weight of what they carried. Hamish began the 4th day of his quiet inquiry, the same way he began most things in Lockdub, with walking, watching, and allowing himself to be seen. In a village the size of Lockdub, absence could be as revealing as presence, and Hamish made a point of appearing everywhere he normally would. He walked past the shop, nodded at the post office window, paused to straighten a notice that did not need straightening. People noticed. They always did. The cold had softened slightly, enough for the frost to retreat into the shadows. The hills looked gentler for it, though Hamish knew better than to trust appearances. He turned his steps toward the older part of the village, where houses sat a little farther apart and memories ran deeper. Ian Fraser had been born in Lockdub. That alone carried a certain weight. People who stayed their whole lives in one place were expected to fit themselves neatly into it, to smooth their edges, to accept small injustices for the sake of harmony. Hamish had learned that lesson early. Some learnt it better than others. He stopped first at the cottage of Morag Campbell, who had known Ian since childhood. Morag answered the door with a cautious smile and ushered him in without being asked. The room smelled of baking and peat smoke, comforting in a way that made conversation easier. "I suppose you'll be wanting to ask about Ian," she said, setting a plate of scones between them. "I would," Hamish replied, "if you don't mind." Morag folded her hands. "He was troubled," she said simply. "Not in his head, in his heart." Hamish waited. "He'd taken on too much," she continued. "Not work, responsibility, things people expected of him without ever asking." She spoke of small things at first, watching over a neighbor's sheep when illness struck, keeping an eye on land that was no longer clearly anyone's, standing between arguments that were never officially his to settle. "He didn't complain," Morag said, "but that doesn't mean she didn't feel it." Hamish thanked her and left, the weight of her words settling alongside others he had collected. From there he walked toward the lower road, where newer houses stood, not new in any real sense, but newer than the rest. Change had arrived in Lockdub slowly, disguised as necessity. A bit of development here, a reallocation of grazing there. Always small, always explained. At the edge of the road stood a field that had once belonged to the Frasers. Hamish stopped, resting his arms on the gate. The land lay quiet, sheep grazing under the watchful eye of a man Hamish did not recognize. "You're not from round here," Hamish said mildly. The man looked up, startled, then nodded. "No, helping out. Temporary." "Who owns the land now?" Hamish asked. The man hesitated. "It's complicated." Complicated, Hamish had found, was another word people used when they preferred not to explain themselves. He did not press. Instead, he walked on, letting the question settle where it would. That afternoon, Hamish visited Ian's house again, this time with permission. Inside, everything was in its place, but there was a feeling of compression, as though Ian had been holding himself in. On the small table by the window lay a folded piece of paper, placed deliberately beneath a stone. Hamish unfolded it carefully. It was not a note in the dramatic sense. No accusations. No farewells. Just a list, written in Ian's steady hand. Names, dates, boundaries sketched in the margins. Grazing rotations. Old agreements. Promises, Hamish thought. The list told a quiet story of land shared, favors returned, arrangements made without witnesses or paperwork, the kind of system that worked only as long as everyone remembered it the same way. But memories, Hamish knew, were fragile things. As evening drew in, the village gathered again in small knots. Hamish stood outside the shop, speaking briefly with those who passed. He did not mention the paper. He did not mention the land. He spoke instead of the weather, of sheep, of nothing at all. And still reactions came. A tightening of the jaw when certain names were mentioned, a look away, a hurried change of subject. Later, alone in his kitchen, Hamish laid the paper out on the table. He traced the lines with his finger, not reading so much as feeling the rhythm of it. Elaine had been keeping track, not out of greed, but out of fairness. The birch trees rose again in Hamish's mind. A meeting place, perhaps somewhere neutral, somewhere private. He did not believe Elaine had gone there by accident. He believed he had gone there to speak to someone, and that someone, Hamish suspected, had carried away more than just words that night. The cold had not killed Ian Fraser. It had merely finished what silence had begun. By the 5th day, the village had settled into a subdued rhythm, one shaped as much by politeness as by grief. People spoke kindly of Ian Fraser now, in the careful past tense reserved for those who could no longer contradict the stories told about them. He had been steady, dependable, a good man. All of it was true, and all of it was incomplete. Hamish felt the shape of what was missing more keenly than ever. He began the morning at the river path, where the ground dipped and the sound of water softened the air. It was a place people walked when they wanted to think without being overheard. Hamish had no particular destination in mind, only a desire to let the village reveal itself in its own time. Halfway along the path, he encountered Mrs. Kerr, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She stopped when she saw him, relief flickering across her face before she composed herself. "Cold for walking," she said. Hamish agreed. "But good for the head." They walked together for a while, side by side, neither rushing. It was Mrs. Kerr who broke the silence. "Ian was kind to my sister," she said. "When she was alive, kept an eye on her sheep when she couldn't manage." Hamish nodded. "He did that for a few folk." She hesitated. "That sort of kindness. It creates expectations." There it was again. Not resentment, not anger, expectation, the quiet pressure of being relied upon. Later at the pub, Hamish listened as the talk drifted toward land and weather and back again. Someone mentioned the field on the lower road. Someone else replied too quickly that it was all properly arranged. Now Hamish watched the exchange. The way eyes slid away from one another. Proper arrangements, he thought, were not always proper in the same way for everyone. He left the pub and walked toward the edge of the village, stopping at the house of Ewan McCrae. Ewan was not unkind, nor was he cruel. He was simply ambitious in the mild, practical way of men who believed progress was a moral good. Ewan greeted Hamish with forced cheer. "Terrible business about Ian," he said. "Terrible." "Aye," Hamish replied. "He was worried before he died." Ewan's smile faltered, then returned. "We're all worried from time to time. About promises," Hamish added lightly. There was a pause, just long enough. Ewan sighed and gestured Hamish inside. The house was warm, the furnishings new, but chosen to resemble the old. Ewan poured tea with unnecessary care. Ian didn't like the changes, Ewan said finally. Said things were being forgotten. And were they? Hamish asked. Ewan stared into his cup. Times change. Old understandings aren't always practical. Hamish said nothing. "I never meant him harm," Ewan went on, his voice tightening. "I only meant to talk," to explain. The birch trees rose sunbeaten between them. That evening Hamish walked the held track alone, stopping beneath the bare branches where Yane had been found. The place felt ordinary. Now, too ordinary. Whatever had happened here had been quiet, intimate. Hamish pictured Ian standing in the cold, list folded in his pocket, waiting, not for an enemy, but for someone he believed would listen. A man like Ian would not have shouted. He would have reasoned, appealed to memory, to fairness. And if that failed, Hamish closed his eyes briefly. The cold had not come suddenly. It would have crept in, minute by minute, while conversation stalled, while emotions tightened instead of loosening. Back in the village, lamps flickered on. Life continued. It always did. Hamish sat at his table, the list before him once more. It was not evidence in any official sense. It was a map of relationships, of quiet debts, and shifting loyalties. Someone had asked Ian to let go, and Ian, stubborn in his gentle way, had refused. The village would not call it murder. Not openly. It would call it misfortune, exposure, an unfortunate night. But Hamish knew better. This was not a crime of violence. It was a crime of indifference. The sixth day brought with it a change so subtle that most of Logdeb would not have named it, though they felt it all the same. The village had moved beyond shock and into something quieter and more difficult. Recognition, not of guilt, exactly, but of proximity. Whatever had happened to Ian Fraser was no longer safely distant. It had happened among them, shaped by habits and silences they all understood too well. Hamish sensed it as he walked through the village that morning. People still greeted him, still spoke kindly, but there was a new caution in their eyes, as though each word might reveal more than intended. The village was thinking now, retracing its own steps. He stopped by the kirk again, not to speak with the minister this time, but to sit alone for a while. The building was cold and faintly damped, the pews polished smooth by generations of patient hands. Hamish sat near the back, letting the stillness settle around him. He thought of Ewan McCrae's face as he spoke of change, of Morog's quiet certainty that Ian had carried too much, of the list, not a challenge, but a reminder. None of it pointed to cruelty, it pointed to avoidance. People did not like being reminded of promises they no longer wished to keep. When Hamish left the kirk, he found Mrs. Wallace waiting outside the shop, her arms folded tight against the cold. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, "about that night." "So have I," Hamish replied. "Ian came in just before closing," she said. "Didn't buy anything. Just stood there a moment, like he was gathering himself." Gamish nodded. "Did he say where he was going?" "No," she said, but he asked if Ewan had been by earlier. That was new. Hamish thanked her and continued on, the village rearranging itself quietly in his mind. By afternoon, Hamish had decided what he needed to do. Not confront, not accuse. Simply create a space where truth could surface without being forced. In Lockdub, pressure only drove things deeper underground. He invited Ewan McCrae for a walk. They did not speak much at first, their boots crunching softly along the path toward the birch trees. The sky hung low, colorless, the sort of sky that encouraged honesty by offering no distractions. "Ian asked to meet me," Ewan said at last. "I didn't seek him out." "I know," Hamish said. "He had that paper with him," Ewan continued. "Laid it out like it was a sacred thing. Told me I was standing on ground that wasn't properly mine. "And were you?" Hamish asked gently. Iwan exhaled sharply. "Legally, I. Practically, maybe not. Not in the old sense." They stopped beneath the trees. The place felt less like a scene now, and more like a threshold, somewhere decisions had been made, quietly but irrevocably. "I told him the village needed to move on," Yuan said, "that clinging to old arrangements would only hold us back. And he didn't agree." "No," Yuan said softly. He said fairness wasn't old-fashioned. They stood in silence. The wind moved through the branches above them, a dry whisper. "I didn't leave him there," Yuan said at last. "I walked away. Angry. Yes, but I thought he'd follow once he cooled down." Hamish believed him, not because the words were polished, but because they were clumsy with regret. "You didn't make him stay," Hamish said, "but you knew he wouldn't leave easily." Iwan closed his eyes. He'd already been cold. He wasn't well. "I could see it. And still you left." Iwan nodded, the motion barely perceptible. "I told myself he was stubborn enough to come back. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility." Hamish said nothing. There was no need. They walked back in silence. At the edge of the village, Yuan stopped. "I didn't kill him," he said, not defensively, but desperately. "No," Hamish agreed. "You didn't." That evening, Hamish sat alone with the list one final time. He folded it carefully and placed it back beneath the stone. It did not belong in a report. It belonged where it had always belonged, among the quiet understandings that shaped the village. There would be no arrest. No trial. Only an adjustment, slow and imperfect. The grazing would be rebalanced. Names would be spoken differently now, and one man would carry a weight he had not expected, perhaps for the rest of his life. As darkness settled over Lakhdab, Hamish looked out at the village lights, steady and warm against the cold. Justice, he thought, did not always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrived as remembrance, and sometimes that had to be enough. The seventh day dawned with a thin veil of snow, light enough not to disrupt the village, but heavy enough to soften its edges. Lakhdab looked almost forgiving beneath it, as though the land itself wished to draw a clean line over what had happened. Snow had that effect on people. It suggested endings, even when none had truly come. Hamish noticed the change immediately. People stepped more carefully, spoke more gently. The village had reached the stage where it wished to be kind to itself. He spent the morning doing nothing that could be called official. He walked the main road twice. He stopped to help Mrs. McLean carry her shopping. He stood outside the post office, long enough for 2 separate conversations to find him. This was not idleness. This was listening. The story circulating now was a quieter one. Iyane had been old. The cold had been sharp. These things happened. No one said them with cruelty. They said them with relief. Relief that the explanation required nothing further of them. Hamish did not interrupt. He let the narrative form, noting where it smoothed over discomfort and where it hesitated. At the shop, Mrs. Wallace spoke with unusual "He shouldn't have been left there," she said. "Not to Hamish, but to the shelves. Whatever the disagreement was." "That's true," Hamish said. She looked at him then, her eyes sharp. "But saying it now doesn't change anything, does it?" "No," Hamish agreed. "It doesn't." This was the village's first myth, forming quietly that there had been nothing to be done, that events had moved too quickly. That responsibility had been too diffuse to belong to any one person. Hamish understood the need for such stories. They allowed people to keep living beside one another without flinching. By afternoon, he found himself at the edge of the lower road again, watching the sheep move across the land that was still being argued over in softer terms. The man tending them nodded politely and kept his distance. Ownership, like guilt, was being handled delicately now. Hamish thought of Ain Fraser, not as he had been found, but as he had lived. Steady, quiet, endlessly accommodating. A man who had believed that reminding people of fairness was not an act of aggression. He wondered how often such men were mistaken for obstacles. Later, Hamish visited Morag Campbell once more. She poured tea and listened as he spoke. Not of Ewan, not of the meeting, but of Ain. He didn't mean to cause trouble, Hamish said. Morag smiled sadly. That was his trouble. They sat together in silence, the kind that did not need explanation. As evening settled in, Hamish walked to the river path again. Snow muted the sound of water, turning it into a distant murmur. He stood there longer than he meant to, thinking about the line the village was drawing for itself. No one would name what had truly happened. They would not call it murder, nor even negligence. They would call it unfortunate, unavoidable, and perhaps, in practical terms, that was enough. But Hamish knew that something else was happening beneath the surface. The village was adjusting its conscience. He returned home and wrote a brief report, factual, restrained, unembellished, exposure, contributing factors, no suspicion of criminal intent. It was the truth, as far as the law required it. He folded the paper and set it aside, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret. That night, the pub was fuller than it had been in days. People laughed softly. Someone played music badly and was forgiven for it. Life, unmistakably, was continuing. Hamish sat at his usual table, nursing a pint. He watched Ewan McRae enter, hesitate, then join a group near the fire. No one shunned him. No one embraced him either. He would find his place again, slowly, if he was patient. The village did not punish. It absorbed. As Hamish left the pub later, snow still falling lightly, he felt the weight of the case settling into something less sharp, though no less present. Some mysteries did not end with answers. They ended with acceptance. Behind him, Loch Dubb glowed warmly against the dark. Ahead of him, the hills waited, unchanged. And somewhere between the two, the truth remained, not hidden, but quietly carried by those who knew it, shaping the village in ways that would only become clear with time. The eighth day arrived without ceremony, the snow already beginning to thin and slide from the roofs, retreating into the ditches, where it would linger a while longer. Loch Dubb did not mark the passage of time with announcements. It simply adjusted itself, the way an old body shifted to ease an ache, without expecting it ever to vanish entirely. Hamish felt the shift as he made his morning round. The conversations were lighter now, the pauses less charged. People spoke of ordinary things again. Lambing schedules, the price of fuel, the inconvenience of the weather. Ain Fraser's name still surfaced, but differently. Not as a question, as a presence. At the kirk, preparations were underway for a small memorial. Nothing elaborate. Loch Dubb did not care for a spectacle. A few flowers, a few hymns, enough to acknowledge that a life had ended and that it mattered. Hamish stood at the back during the service, his hands folded loosely, listening as the minister spoke of stewardship and kindness. He noticed who had chosen to sit where. Morag Campbell near the front, her posture straight. Mrs. Wallace beside her, eyes down. Ewan McRae, a few rows back, alone, his gaze fixed ahead, his expression carefully blank when the service ended. people lingered, reluctant to return to their routines too abruptly. Small groups formed, shifted, dissolved. It was in these moments Hamish knew that the village did its real work. Outside, Morag touched Ewan's arm lightly. He stiffened, then relaxed. "He meant well," she said. Ewan nodded, his voice thick. "So did he." They stood together a moment longer than expected, and when they parted, something had eased between them. Not resolve. Eased. Hamish watched from a distance, not intervening. Evidence, he thought, did not always come in the form of objects or statements. Sometimes it appeared as a change in the way people held themselves. That afternoon, Hamish returned once more to the birch trees, not because he expected to find anything new, but because places remembered even when people tried not to. The ground had been disturbed by footprints in the days since, the exact spot less clear now, but the feeling remained. He stood quietly, hands in his pockets, letting the cold work its way through him. He imagined Eain there again, not in his final stillness, but alive, standing patiently, waiting to be heard. "You were right," Hamish murmured, though there was no one to hear him. On his way back, he stopped at the field on the lower road. The sheep had been moved. The gate stood open in invitation rather than neglect. Change, Hamish reflected, did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives because someone had finally listened. In the evening, Hamish received a visit from Yuan. The man stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand. "I'm putting things back," Yuan said. "As much as can be put back," Hamish nodded. "That's something." "I should have stayed," Yuan said quietly. "That night?" "Yes," Hamish replied. "You should have." There was no accusation in his voice, just acknowledgement. Yuan exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and grief. "I'll carry it," he said. What I didn't do, Hamish believed him. After Yuan left, Hamish sat alone, the house unusually still. He thought of all the cases that never reached a courtroom, of all the truths that lived and died in kitchens and fields. Justice, he knew, was not always a matter of punishment. Sometimes it was a matter of balance. The days that followed slipped into one another, the village gradually returning to itself. Sheep were counted, roads were cleared, children returned to their routines. Life resumed, altered but intact. One afternoon, Hamish walked past the shop and noticed a small sign in the window, a notice about shared grazing, updated and neatly written. He stopped to read it twice, then smiled faintly. Eain Fraser's handwriting was not there, but his influence was. That evening, as darkness settled and lights blinked on across Lockdeb, Hamish stood at his window and looked out at the village. It felt familiar again, though not unchanged. It never truly was. Somewhere in the quiet spaces between houses, the village held its breath, not in fear now, but in remembrance. And Hamish, watching over it all, understood that this was how the place healed, not by forgetting, but by carrying its stories forward gently, like embers kept warm against the cold. By the 9th day, Lockdub had settled into something that resembled peace, though Hamish knew better than to mistake it for closure. Villages like this did not close chapters so much as fold them carefully and place them on a shelf where they could be taken down and examined again if the light shifted just so. The morning arrived gray and mild, the kind of weather that suggested winter was loosening its grip, if only a little. Hamish walked without a coat for the first time in days, feeling the damp air on his face. Change, he reflected, was always gradual and locked up, quiet enough that people could convince themselves it had been their idea all along. At the shop, Mrs. Wallace was laughing with a customer. the sound tentative but real. She caught sight of Hamish and nodded, a look passing between them that needed no words. Things were not forgotten, but they were being placed gently where they could be lived with. Hamish continued on toward the river path, where the water ran faster now, freed from its icy restraint. He stopped to watch it for a while, thinking of how Ain Fraser might have stood there himself, once content to observe rather than interfere. Later that day, Hamish paid a visit to Iain's house. Arrangements were being made quietly, possessions sorted, books boxed, tools claimed by those who would use them. Nothing dramatic, just the careful redistribution of a life. Morag Campbell was there, overseeing matters with calm authority. She greeted Hamish warmly. "He wouldn't have wanted fuss," she said, "but he'd have wanted things to be useful." Hamish nodded, walking through the rooms. The house felt lighter now, as though the tension it had held was being released. On the small table by the window, the stone still rested where Hamish had placed it, though the paper beneath it was gone. Ewan took the list. Morag said, noticing his glance. Said he'd keep it. "As a reminder." "That seems fitting," Hamish replied. Outside, the village carried on with its quiet adjustments. A meeting was held in the hall, informal, well-attended, and notable mainly for its lack of argument. Agreements were restated, boundaries clarified. No one mentioned Iain by name, but he was present all the same, shaping the discussion. Hamish sat near the back, listening. This was not his doing, he knew. It was simply the result of something having been made visible. In the afternoon, he walked the hill track once more, not out of necessity, but habit. The birch trees stood bare, patient. He paused there briefly, then continued on, feeling no need to linger. As he returned, he encountered Ewan again, this time by the lower field. The man was supervising the repair of a stone wall, his sleeves rolled up, his movements careful. "Doing it properly now," Ewan said, meeting Hamish's gaze. "Aye," Hamish said. "It shows." They stood watching the work for a moment, neither speaking. There was no friendship there, but there was understanding. That evening, Hamish sat in his kitchen with a simple meal and a glass of milk. He ate slowly, thinking of the line between responsibility and blame, of how easily the two were confused. The law, Hamish reflected, dealt in clear edges, right and wrong, guilty and not. But life in locked-up existed in softer gradients. Ain Fraser had not been pushed. He had not been struck. He had not been threatened. And yet his death had been shaped by another man's choice to walk away, by a village's slow drift from its own promises. Was that a crime? Hamish leaned back in his chair, listening to the familiar creaks of the house. He knew the answer the law would give. He also knew the answer the village had chosen. Outside, night settled gently over Loch. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. Lights winked out one by one. Hamish rose and washed his plate, the ordinary motions grounding him. Tomorrow would bring new concerns, lost sheep, petty disputes, life undramatic and ongoing. Before turning in, he stepped outside and looked up at the hills, dark and patient against the sky. They had seen all of this before, he knew, and they would see it again. As he closed the door behind him, Hamish felt a quiet certainty settle within him. Not satisfaction, not regret, understanding. And in a place like Loch Deb, that was often the closest thing to resolution there was. The 10th day dawned clear, the sky rinsed pale blue by a night of wind. The hills stood sharp and familiar against the light, their lines unchanged, their presence steady. Locked Up woke, as it always did, with no sense of ending, only continuation. If the village had learned anything in the days since Ian Fraser's death, it was not how to close a story, but how to carry it. Hamish Macbeth rose early, as was his habit, and stood for a moment at his kitchen window, mug warming his hands. Across the village, smoke lifted from chimneys, the same thin columns he had watched so many mornings before. There was comfort in their familiarity. The world had not broken. It had only shifted. He dressed and stepped outside. The air cool, but no longer biting. Spring was still a distant promise, but winter had loosened its hold. Hamish walked without purpose at first, letting his feet choose the path. This was how he often marked the end of things, not with decisions, but with movement. At the shop, Mrs. Wallace was restocking shelves, humming quietly. She paused to greet him, her expression easy now. "Morning," she said. "Looks like a better day." "It does," Hamish agreed. She hesitated, then added, "We'll mind things better now." Hamish met her gaze and nodded. That, he thought, was as close to a vow as Log Deb ever made. He continued on, past the post office, past the pub, toward the river path. The water moved briskly, catching the light. Hamish stood watching it, thinking of how many times he had done so before, and how many times he would do so again. The village was a collection of such moments, repeated with small variations, each one layered atop the last. Later, he walked up toward the hills, not to the birch trees this time, but along a familiar route where sheep grazed lazily, watched over by a man who lifted a hand in greeting. The land looked settled, as though it had exhaled. Hamish stopped at a rise and looked back toward Loch Dubh. From here, the village seemed small, almost fragile, nestled against the vastness around it. And yet it endured. He thought of Ian Fraser, not of his final night, but of the many days before it, of a man who had believed in fairness so quietly that others had come to depend on it without noticing. Ian's mistake, if it could be called that, had been in assuming that what was understood would always be remembered. But memory, Hamish knew, needed tending. As he turned back, he encountered Ewan McCrae on the path. The man stopped, uncertain, then spoke. "I've been thinking," Ewan said, "about what comes next." Hamish waited. "I don't expect forgiveness," Ewan went on, "but I mean to do better." "That's all anyone can do," Hamish replied. They parted without ceremony, each returning to his own business. No reckoning had been proclaimed, no balance sheet drawn up, only the slow, ongoing work of living with one's choices. That afternoon, Hamish returned home and sat at his table, writing a few lines in his notebook. Not an official record, just observations, names, small details he did not wish to forget. He closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer, where it would remain until something nudged him to open it again. Outside, children's voices drifted faintly through the air, a sound that always surprised him with its reassurance. Life continued, unburdened by the need for certainty. As evening approached, the village lights came on, one by one. Hamish prepared a simple supper and ate it slowly, content in the knowledge that there was nothing pressing to be done. When he stepped outside later, the sky was deepening toward indigo, the first stars appearing. He breathed in the cold, clean air and felt not resolution, but something steadier, belonging. Loch Dubh would carry Ian Fraser with it, in altered agreements, in quieter assumptions, in the way people paused now before walking away from a conversation unfinished. His presence would linger, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Hamish looked down the street, the familiar shapes and shadows forming a pattern he knew by heart. The village held its secret still, as it always would, but it also held its people. And as long as someone was willing to listen, truly listen, those secrets would never become too heavy to bear. With that thought, Hamish turned back toward his house, the door closing softly behind him. The village settling into the night whole, imperfect and enduring.